When people talk about Laverne and Shirley, they often remember the catchy theme song first. But once the music fades, a specific question lingers for anyone who ever loved that era of sitcom magic. How did two unknown comics with a goofy entrance and a stranger greeting become cultural icons? And why, for years, did Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall quietly avoid telling the full story of what it was really like working alongside Lenny and Squiggy? To understand that silence and what it meant, you have to start long before the show. Not on a studio lot, not in front of a live audience, but in a cramped living room where a single creaky door changed the course of television comedy. It began as a small gathering in the mid-1970s. Someone was hosting Friends, and two men, Michael McKean and David Lander, arrived with an idea. They weren't planning to perform anything special. Yet, as the evening unfolded, it became clear that something was unfolding organically, something raw and delightful. Two characters emerging right in front of everyone's eyes. The moment Lander cracked the door open and delivered that peculiar, drawn-out hello, the room transformed. People leaned in. A burst of laughter shot across the space, the kind of laughter that doesn't come from a joke, but from a presence. McKean, standing just behind him with slick-back hair and a frozen, almost bewildered expression, completed the picture. It was chemistry, energy, and timing wrapped in the simplest possible package. At that time, they weren't Lenny and Squiggy yet. They were two actors testing characters, discovering rhythms, exploring the balance between stupidity and sincerity that would make their duo unforgettable. But that living room performance carved the path that would soon lead them inside one of television's most iconic sitcom worlds. Fate tends to disguise itself as coincidence. In this case, coincidence came in the form of Penny Marshall, who happened to be at that gathering. Penny saw something in those two characters, something raw enough to mold but sharp enough to shine. She wasn't just amused, she was impressed in a way that stuck with her. Later, when she found out McKean and Lander were in the same acting class, she thought of that night. And once filming for Laverne and Shirley began, she remembered that creaky living room door and the reaction it produced. Something clicked. She approached them, not to offer them roles yet, but to describe a situation. The show was being built around a very specific comedic energy, two independent women navigating life with grit, awkward charm, and plenty of mishaps. But Penny knew the world needed disruption, chaos, a counterforce. And those characters she saw in that living room, they were pure, unfiltered chaos. She invited McKean and Lander to the set, not with a script, not with a contract, but with possibility. When the producers first considered introducing Lander's character, the original name was Anthony. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't right either. It didn't sound like the character. It didn't match the sloped shoulders, the oddly proud pout, or the mildly aggressive friendliness that defined him. Lander knew that the comedy didn't stop at the punchline. Comedy begins with the expectation the audience builds the moment a character walks into a room. And so he asked for a change. Inspired by people he grew up with, kids who had unforgettable nicknames and stranger reputations, he suggested a name that stuck in people's throats on the way out. Squiggy. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't subtle, and it was perfect. Names telegraph everything. As Lander later said, you hear a name like Squiggy, and you already know who he is before he speaks. Anthony was a guy, Squiggy was a force of nature. With the name decided, a second question emerged. How should Squiggy enter the room? Lander experimented with the voice, shrill, nasally, slightly confrontational. He tested head movements, posture, and a particular brand of overconfidence that only made sense coming from someone with absolutely no reason to be confident. The result was an entrance that became a comedic signature. The sudden swing of the door, the stiff posture, the desperate attempt to appear suave, and then the greeting that sounded somewhere between a threat and a nervous introduction, hello. It was deceptively simple, barely a word, yet instantly recognizable. Actors dream of catchphrases and memorable lines. Lander created one using only tone, and over time, the writers recognized something powerful. Every time that door creaked open, the audience erupted before Squiggy even finished saying hello. That entrance was comedic currency. Where Squiggy brought chaos, Lenny brought contrast. Michael McKean understood that comedy often relies on what he called the comedy math of opposites. One character overthinks. The other doesn't think at all. One is eager. The other is too confident. One is sincere. The other is bizarre. McKean played Lenny as a man whose reality never quite lined up with the real world. He wasn't dumb, just tuned into a different frequency. His slightly vacant, yet hopeful expression matched Squiggy's misplaced swagger. Watching them side by side, you could see a long history, real or imagined, between two men who navigated life together not because they had anything in common, but because they had never quite learned how to exist apart. This contrast made them gold. They weren't just side characters. They were a receiving system for chaos, a sort of gravitational pull that tilted every scene they entered. As Lenny and Squiggy became more prominent, something unexpected happened. Their comedic presence kept tempting the cast to break character. Breaking on a sitcom set, especially one filmed in front of a live audience, isn't just a blooper. It resets momentum. It rattles the crew. And if it happens too often, it makes the actors look unprofessional. Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall quickly discovered that the duo's timing and unexpected delivery created a real challenge. Sometimes it was the unpredictable inflection of Squiggy. Sometimes it was the awkward pause McKean let linger before Lenny delivered a line. And sometimes it was simply the silence before the storm, the moment the door moved and the audience roared with anticipation. Penny and Cindy had to develop strategies. The most common? Avoid eye contact. Look at the wall. Look at the floor. Just don't look at Squiggy. Cindy joked years later that if I looked him in the eyes, it was over. She meant it. There were scenes where she nearly bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. But in interviews long after the show ended, both women intentionally softened how much they admitted this. And that is the beginning of understanding why they stayed silent. This wasn't a scandal. It wasn't tension. It wasn't resentment. What Cindy and Penny didn't explain fully for many years was something simple. They didn't want to diminish the craft behind what looked like chaos. Lenny and Squiggy were funny, wildly funny, but that didn't mean they weren't skilled. Their comedy wasn't uncontrolled. It was calculated. Their entrances weren't random. They were rehearsed. Their ability to almost cause breaks wasn't immaturity. It was mastery. To openly admit how difficult they were to work with, how much discipline it took to hold scenes together, could have made people misinterpret the duo's brilliance as disruption. And Penny, being a director at heart and an actor who respected craft above all, wasn't going to allow that narrative. Cindy felt the same. They protected the show by protecting the truth behind its hardest-working performers. Their silence wasn't avoidance. It was respect. Gary Marshall, the creator and comedic architect behind the show, understood what most viewers didn't. You can't let comedy run wild without structure. He is the one who coined the term comedy math for the cast. According to him, a successful sitcom scene balanced 1. The premise 2. 3. The characters 4. 5. The punchline 6. Too much of any one thing, and the audience feels fatigued. And Gary believed that Lenny and Squiggy were an extra variable. They were a comedy multiplier. If you didn't place them carefully, they'd blow the whole equation apart. This meant crew members had to position cameras in anticipation of instant audience laughter. It meant writers had to structure scenes with a Lenny/Squiggy window in mind. And it meant actors had to mentally prepare for a sudden shift in energy the moment one of them entered the room. It wasn't easy, but it was magic. Despite the strategies, the warnings, the deep breaths before scenes, the cast still found it nearly impossible not to react. A big reason was timing. McKean and Lander were masters of microscopic timing details. The half-second pause before speaking, the glide or stumble into a room, the unexpected ending of a sentence, the bizarre logic of their conversations. Actors describe these tiny decisions as landmines. You rehearse one version, then the duo adjusts it live, just enough to keep it fresh, but not enough to break the structure. Sometimes Squiggy's hello would be higher pitched. Sometimes Lenny's stare would last a beat too long. Sometimes they'd sync their movements like two characters in a cartoon, turning a simple moment into a comedic explosion. That's what made them irresistible. Behind the scenes, the bond between McKean and Lander was the foundation for everything their characters did. They weren't just scene partners, they were lifelong collaborators. They refined their bits for years. At parties, in acting classes, in small performances, in private rehearsals no one else knew about. They developed a telepathic rhythm. McKean once said, "We didn't have to talk. We just had a look." Lander confirmed this, saying that even their mistakes became intentional bits when they trusted each other enough to improvise through moments. That trust made their partnership airtight. David Lander's later years added another chapter to the Lenny and Squiggy story that many fans didn't know. He was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a disease that slowly affected his mobility and speech. Yet, he didn't disappear from acting. He adapted. He shifted to voice roles, guest appearances, and behind-the-scenes work. And McKean stayed close, just as devoted off-screen as the pair had always been on-screen. When Lander passed away in 2020, tributes poured in, not just about Squiggy, but about his heart, humor, and resilience. McKean's tribute was simple and devastating. "He was my best friend." It was the closing of a chapter that started in a living room with a cracked door.